tonight's installment of the Iamblichus reading group, we dive into the mysteries and technical details of theurgic ritual. We look at what has been called a Mithras Liturgy, but which we now know of as a Hermetic text, more correctly called the Immortalization Rite or the Ion Liturgy. With Christian Bull's brilliant historical reconstruction in mind, the text offers up its secret links to the Way of Hermes and the tradition of the Egyptian temple rites. Listen in as Farjana, Ryan, Matt, and I discuss how much of the preliminary preparations we can or cannot change to accommodate our modern way of life. Should we abstain from sex before a rite? Should we find a secret drug identified in the text? We also discuss how a written rite differs from what's on the page in being enacted. Listen as we discuss whether we can live a magical life in the hectic hubbub of modern society. We take up these topics and more in tonight's episode of the Iamblichus reading group. Hi everyone, welcome to the Iamblichus reading group, December 15th installment. We have Farjana and Ryan on with us, and as usual I've been starting these out with some comments from me, and then we can get into the discussion with comments from Farjana and Ryan. So just as a general introduction to this reading where we're taking up the so-called Mithras Liturgy, and we agreed to do this because reading this liturgy can give us a feel for the lived reality behind Iamblichus's ideas in the Egyptian mysteries. And I'll explain what I mean by that in the following comments. By seeing how Iamblichus practices what he preaches, we see that his words are not just abstract ideas and concepts, but they describe very real experiences. And as I'll soon discuss, these ideas have a long history extending back into practices which we find in old Egyptian texts, like the Book of the Dead and similar funerary texts. So what is this text? Where does it come from? To answer that question, we must look at Christian Bull's work. He did in his historical book on the Way of Hermes, Bull has written a work that for me revolutionizes the understanding of Egyptian mysticism at the beginning of the Common Era. For close to a century or more, it's been speculated that there was a group of individuals who wrote texts like the Corpus Hermeticum and associated texts, first recovered from obscurity during the Renaissance. This group of texts was further extended with the discovery of two documents in the now famous cache at Nag Hammadi. By analyzing the old and new texts in a new and detailed way, Christian Bull proves the existence of a group of Egyptian mystics who gathered together and enacted rites similar to those described in the texts. These practices and beliefs comprise what Bull calls the Way of Hermes. The Way of Hermes includes the occult beliefs and rites and knowledge passed down from the time of the pharaohs through the generations by the god Hermes. That's the storyline that the Way of Hermes follows. The writings reporting this knowledge are called Hermetic, again named for the god who passed them down, Hermes. We also see remnants of these rites in another book called the Greek Magical Papyri. Bull's study of the Way of Hermes is important to our study of Iamblichus. He convincingly gives evidence to show that Iamblichus knows of and uses Hermetic ideas in his writings. As we read the Egyptian mysteries, Iamblichus's knowledge of Egyptian mysticism stares us in the face. However, many scholars in the past thought that Iamblichus was just making up the Egyptian part. He was just playing a role to make his ideas seem ancient, following a fad of the time for all things Oriental, similarly to intellectual fashions we see in our own time. But with Boole's discovery, we can now say that Iamblichus literally knew and used ancient Egyptian Hermetic doctrine and lore. What nails Boole's case for me is his analysis of Iamblichus's understanding of Egyptian Hermetic magic, which is chapter 5 in Iamblichus's Egyptian Mysteries. This chapter is important because it shows that Iamblichus's theurgy is closer to magic than scholars have previously acknowledged. Much of the time, scholars try to drive a wedge between theurgy and magic. If Boole is right, that dichotomy is unwarranted and potentially limits our understanding of the power and impact of theurgy. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's talk about the so-called Mithras Liturgy, which we all read for tonight, and how it relates to Iamblichus. There's a lot of scholarly debate about the Mithras Liturgy, most agreeing that it has nothing to do with Mithras nor liturgy. Let's treat that debate as water under the bridge for now. Our reason for reading this rite is to get close to rituals and beliefs that Iamblichus might have enacted and had in mind while he's writing the Egyptian Mysteries. We don't know that Iamblichus literally used this rite itself, but it is thought that he and other theurgists used similar rites as this, as well as those in the Greek magical papyri. Before we proceed, though, we must stop calling this rite the Mithras Liturgy, I believe. I think we should adopt Boole's designation of it as the Immortalization Rite. Placed in its historical context, it is, Boole shows, a handbook version of the visionary rites that we find in Corpus Hermeticum's Book 13, On the Rebirth, as well as the Discourse on the 8th and 9th, the text found at Nag Hammadi. Following Dieter Betz, who is the editor of the Greek magical papyri, Boole calls the Immortalization rite a reworked Egyptian temple rite that has been repurposed for more general use. The rite provides the nitty-gritty details of how to carry out the rite. In this text, we find an ascent to the heavens where initiates can be immortalized and gain immortal eyes. Being immortalized means acquiring special and unique powers akin to those the gods have. With the immortal eyes, we gain insight into how to live our lives outside fate and destiny, and we see how we can find a way to immortality after death. In some ways, the Immortalization rite describes something similar to the search and attainment of a vision which the Native American seeker finds in their vision quest. This vision establishes oneself as a human who follows higher purpose while also gaining insight into one's path in life. The actual steps to setting up the rite are given at the end. Let's start there to see what information about theurgic rites that we can gain. We will see that with the correct theurgic paraphernalia in place, we can ascend through the heavens, moving through various levels of cosmic reality, which are fraught with danger. We are given the passwords we need to silence the powers that threaten us, and as we ascend, we gain a growing consciousness of our place in the cosmic economy. So like I said, I wanted to welcome also King 9 to the discussion. Thanks for joining again, King. Appreciate it. So anyone want to also provide some preliminary remarks before we get into the text itself?
Yeah, I just wanted to make a quick comment that it's not something that I'm familiar with, so it's really kind of new territory for me. I think I'll be more of a listener in this episode rather than really kind of having a grasp or understanding of this process or this procedure. I did find, just a quick comment, that it did very much feel like magic, like a spell that I have come across in other texts, and really kind of trying to get in contact with these beings or these spirits or whatever it is that you try to get in contact with. They say the higher beings or the gods, and it's never kind of felt like a resonance with me personally. So that's why I kind of never delved into any type of magic. I'm open to it because I like to be open-minded and I'm very interested in it. But I just wanted to make that comment because I don't have any experience. So I'll hand it over to the expert.
Well, yeah, I think Ryan, well, thanks, Farjan, and I think that's fair. I think that your comments are fair, and hopefully, what we talk about will be able to give some more insight into it. Maybe not
Yeah,
to
definitely.
convince you to
Definitely.
participate in it, but to
Yeah.
definitely gain some insight. But
Mm-hmm.
Ryan, you've actually performed the rite.
Yeah, so I've actually done this one a few times, and once with quite, I would say, spectacular results. Granted, I always do modify things a little bit whenever I practice them out of a book, so they really resonate with me. And I think that, that's the first thing to think about when we're starting to tackle this particular text, is that, and I know that there are people that disagree with me on this, so hey, YouTube listeners, if in the comments, if you disagree, love to hear what your thoughts are on it. But I have always been under the impression that the most important, first of all, kind of taking the rite itself out of the conversation just for now. As I've said before, I think one of the most important things in the successful practice of magic, of theurgic rites, any of this sort of stuff, is to ensure that it is the right working for you. I use this one a lot, and I kind of substitute a lot of the verbiage for various different things. But I think that it's really important just to keep in mind, as we're diving into it, that the text itself, I think, is a guide. It's not a rule book. It is what's the word I'm looking for? It illuminates a path without actually guiding you down that path. And I think the most important thing when we're tackling something like this is to first try and understand what they are trying to do with each section of the working. What is the operative force? What are we trying to accomplish with each thing? Because actually, when you start to look into the text itself, there are kind of clear delineations between different aspects of it. So first of all, I think that that's a really important thing to keep in mind, which probably could have been said a lot quicker, in the sense of, do what feels right for you. I'm a very big advocate of that. Having said that, though, this particular ritual, now we're getting into the, what are we calling it? The immortalization, right?
Yeah, I think that's given the fact that it has nothing to do with liturgy or Mithras, I think that's a fair designation.
Yeah. So I think for me, when we're thinking about this particular working, the first thing that I am keeping in mind when I'm starting to do it is the sort of solar implications that the rite has. And then through that, kind of extrapolating, what do these solar associations mean for the working? What does it mean for who we are trying to get into contact with? And how can we use that to push us forward in the working?
Right. Yeah.
So finding those sort of symbolic truths in the text, super important for me. Finding the sort of different operative parts, also super important. And the third one is, and I mean, this is really going out, and I mean, Farzana, I know that this probably isn't your bag. You're probably not going to be doing the initiation, right? But anyone that has not practiced in this way before, The third thing that I will say is like, do not expect for it to happen when it works the way that you expect it to happen. This isn't in the PDF that we shared, but the version of the text that I have in my book, for example, like talks about things like, and then 5 virgins will appear before you, you know?
Right.
I would caution anyone away from using that sort of thinking, at least when you start, because as you're practicing and then you're like, shit, the 5 virgins didn't appear to me. I'm doing something wrong here. You know, like I don't think that that's the right way to think about it. I think that these are things that require consistent practice. They require consistent care and attention. And the more care and attention that we put on them, and the more we think about it, I have really found that like deeper truths are revealed. And that allows you the next time you want to get up and do it, to do it that much more effectively. So like right off the bat, when we're dealing with these theurgic sort of rites, those are kind of the 3 things that I would keep in mind, as someone who has practiced them before.
Excellent. No. I think I would like to get into the details of both the rite and your variation of it. It sounds like you've done a variation of it, and I want to get into that because I think that's unique. I think that's going to be important if people actually want to implement this. And I think it's true that throughout the history of theurgy and magic, there have been adaptations, but in order to get into the details of how you would adapt this and adapt that, I think is probably the important thing to put under the microscope. But I wanted to give Matt a chance. Matt King 9, do you have a chance? Any comments?
I mean, I really liked what Ryan was saying. It kind of rings true for me. I haven't done this particular rite, but kind of in the way that magic works in general. I don't know. When I read the text itself, I thought it was pretty incomprehensible. Honestly, I looked at it and it was very strange. I didn't get the rhyme or reason. Reading the kind of analysis text really made the progression clearer to me. And I think this goes back to what Ryan was saying. You can't really read a ritual, or you can't really understand what you're reading when you're reading through a ritual until you can put those pieces together. Because even though it might seem like a long string of weird statements and strange instructions, there's a potency to each part that you're activating by doing it. And for me, the fact that this seemed so incomprehensible at first glance really drove this point home, actually, because there was such a big difference between my first reading, when I was just kind of confused, and my second reading after going through the explanation text, the academic, the explanation that you provided, and seeing actually like what are you accomplishing at each point.
Yeah, I mean, and I think you bring up a really good, you identify kind of an important topic. What is ritual, right? What's the difference between reading something and actually enacting something? I used to write plays, and one of the things that people who write plays talk about is the difference from reading a play and actually putting the play on. And having actually put plays on, you notice that it really is different from the words in the book, in a text, once you start putting things into action in time and space. And I think that is true of this ritual, of magic rituals as well. They are meant to be enacted. And I think through the actual enactment, then they take on, meaning. It's much more than just textual meaning. It's body meaning, if that makes sense. Your body is actually doing things in space and time that have a meaning to them, almost like if you're riding down a really steep hill And the experience that you're having in your body and in your whole being is totally different than reading about that experience, right? And I think it's something similar to that with the way the ritual works, is that there is a new meaning that comes about in putting it into action.
Yeah, some people semi-jokingly refer to ritual texts as cookbooks, and I think it's a really apt analogy because
well, this has a cookbook aspect, does it? I mean, if you look at the end, right, which is where I wanted to start, but just because it's so weird, right? I mean, there are these things that you have to do, and Ryan, you can chime in about whether you actually did any of these things or not, or whether they're actually necessary. But like getting a beetle and finding a beetle and putting it into a cup.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah, that's what I found, really interesting, because it's like, well, kids do that all the time. They're taking their petals and they're crushing them and putting them in their little cups and adding an insect in there. And I'm just like, this is what it sounds like. It's like, it seems pretty bizarre, but it does seem like there is something in it, some substance, and it has an effect when you've got these ingredients to go with the spell. I found
was
that
it just that you do that, like you're actually going out and finding a beetle, you're
yeah.
putting it into a cup, and you're following the actions? Is that where it actually means something?
I mean, so like speaking to this, again, there are things that I have as a modern dude living in Canada, there are things that I have the ability to procure, and then there are things that I do not. You know what I mean? So like, first you have to look at that, the practicality of it. Like, I mean, like actually you can't get like myrrh and stuff like that. Like it's not impossible. You can just order it on Amazon. But like, yeah. So like there's that consideration is I think the first one to make. Like, what can I do here? But the other thing that I would say is like, again, what are these things representing? Why are we taking a scarab, burying it in a cup with myrrh? Right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, what does that scarab represent to the ritual? What is the symbolic association of the scarab? Why is the covering of that scarab with myrrh valid?
So it's not just to kind of schematize what you're talking about. It's not just the act of finding some bug, putting it into a cup, and then making a cake, and then the bug dying, and then grinding it up and doing all of that stuff. It's understanding what the scarab meant in Egyptian mythology.
It's a synthemata, right? Or I forget the terminology we've been using.
Yeah.
It's the symbol. Yeah.
But well, I mean, in Egyptian mythology, the scarab was was symbolic of the sun.
Yeah, and therefore rebirth, like immortality because of Osiris and the sun, dying every night, being reborn every day, and not being changed by the journey. Sort of, he comes out and he's revealed again. As every rebirth is just a continuation of his same light, his same life. So that's it's like
immortalization comes through the rebirth.
Yeah, exactly. So it sounds right, exactly, and this is exactly what I mean. This kind of thing. You read it at first, and you're like, "What?" But then you start to read it a different way, where instead of just looking at the literal meaning of the instructions and being like, "Well, that's weird," you start to look through the instructions and understand how you are. Like you said, it has an embodied meaning. You're understanding how each part of the ritual, all of the ingredients, are like manifested meanings that instead of reading like a word, you experience in 3D space. Like it's as if the concept were embodied in front of you. It's very hard to explain in words.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's exactly right.
Yeah, I do get that. I mean, I'm understanding what you're saying. So would it be that if these parts are not fulfilled, it would reduce the effectiveness of it?
Yeah, that's where I was going to get to, right? Do you have to do this stuff, or could you make substitutions?
It's pretty common it's pretty common to make substitutions in these kinds of recipes to account for modern life and things like that. I mean, yeah, like in general, I can't say for this particular ritual what those substitutions might be, but among people who practice magic, and they will often who often come across weird instructions or things that seem harder to do now, or that would be disruptive, or I don't know, to things that seem impractical to actually do. People will often make substitutions. Or you know what I mean. You'll also see this historically. It's not just like a concession to being normal. Also, it's you see this when magic moves from one place to another. People will take ingredients and replace them with ingredients that they have near them, especially if the ingredients are plants and animals. So, like, you know, I live in Massachusetts. I'm not going to find a scarab beetle. So, pretty much, if I were to try and do this, it's pretty much a necessity for me to look around and say, well, what's something else that I could use instead? You know, could I use a sunflower? You know what I mean? Like whatever's around me, and figure out what has that virtue. This actually requires you to engage with the text in this way, where you're looking at the embodied meanings and trying to find, you know, whatever has that meaning for you or in your area.
I think
what
that's...
occurred to me?
Sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, carry on. No, finish what you were saying, because this is a slightly different thing.
What I was going to say is, like, to use the scarab example right out of the text, for me, instead of a scarab, I used a leaf for my lemon tree, because that, for me, has that association. It has that solar, that rebirth association. I did not plant it in a bean field because I live in a major city, but I buried it in a pot with soil that I myself had, you know, like, consecrated. So yeah, like, there are definitely substitutions to be made, and I think that, like, if we are if we take a step back from the sort of, like, operations of the issue, and we just think about the idea that, like, if we are going to accept that this stuff is real and that it works, and based on, like, my kind of thought out explanation of why it works, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense for me to assume that you have to be operating in the exact same way that someone, you know, over 2,000 years ago, or I guess slightly less than 2,000 years ago. But anyway, someone that was, like, operating a very long time ago was using, because the world does change. And why would we not assume that because of the changing nature of the world, how the gods associate with the world is not also changing? And I think the place also has something to do with this. You know what I mean? And as well, personality and, like, who you are. For me, like, the lemon is always going to be a symbol of the sun. It will always represent the sun. I've rarely talked to anyone else who practiced that have that same association. I made that association myself. It was through practice, and it was through, and I really liked what you said, Matt, about actually living the text and engaging with the text. Because, yeah, when you, like, frankly, when you first read it, it sounds like nonsense. Full stop, you know?
Well,
but when you
words are pretty nonsensical.
I mean, some of the words are, you know, yeah, like you say, they're intentionally nonsensical, you know?
Well, that's another topic in and of itself. But, you know, we can talk about that. But Farjana, I'm sorry, Matt, I don't want to, Ryan, I don't want to cut you off, but Farjana did want to say something.
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, no, I was just going to make a point that's linked to it, but it's like, you know, having a very good grasp of astrology seems to be extremely important.
Yes.
You've got to know the phase of the moon you're in. You've got to have that knowledge. Then you have to know about the fixed stars. You've got to know about the zodiac, and you've got to know where you're at. So all of these
that's
things
the 3D. That's
together.
the three-dimensional aspect of this. That's what's really fascinating.
Which really kind of, you know, gives. just like, how much is involved and how much knowledge you actually do need and require, because it seems like, like what you said, Ryan, not only the location and then the things that you're going to use, but then also the exact point of the month that you're in, and what's happening with the zodiac and the planets and the sun and the moon, and I think it has to align, and that's why I think that maybe, but this is just my assumption, that according to all of those factors, depends on the efficacy of it. Like, it really will affect how potent it is. I mean, that's what would make sense to me.
There are definitely some rituals which say that, right? I mean, and
Yeah,
I
but
think Proclus also says it.
Yeah, it seems to be one of the foundations.
Right.
According to the different ones that I've read and the kind of things that I've picked out. And then, like what you were saying about the lemon, like I instantly thought, I would substitute it for gold. Like, that really is what would resonate with me. Like, instead of the scarab or the lemon, it would be gold, like the metal. So yeah, I see what you mean by that.
I think a really good way for anyone who's like wanting to get into this to start to practice this way is, and I know that like any sort of like WikiHow article on like how to do magic, how to be a witch says the exact same thing. But it's actually good advice, so I'm going to repeat it. Is start to write, start to build your, if you want to call it a book of shadows or whatever, fine, but start to build your cookbook, your own cookbook. And in that cookbook, the most important thing that you're going to write is correspondence chains. And this is coming straight from like Crowley. I forget what book, but one of Crowley's books.
777.
Yes, thank you. Where you are going to just list and start. I started with the fixed stars, the planets, and their sort of like deity associations in history through that. And then you just move forward from there. So like, I'm just opening my thing right now, and I look like just this one, a few examples. So we've got Mars equals the color red, equals the lion, equals the sword, equals the pumpkin, equals the orange, like the fruit, equals the Eight of Wands. Like, I'm a big tarot guy, so and you can just build and consistently build it, because there will be more things that you find work with that association. Like I've got like 25 of those in here, and like half of them are only half done, but it's just because like I continuously, as I reflect, especially as I like do tarot, as I practice magic, like more of those symbols will become apparent to me. And it's really important when you find what those are for you to embody them, like you said, Matt.
Yeah, and they'll surprise you. And as you engage with these forces, they'll come up in your life, and they'll show you what they are because you're stewing in them. One time, just to continue with the Mars example, I did an invocation of Mars one time. I was just doing a really quick ritual where, like, every day of the week, I would invoke that planet at the beginning of the day and meditate on the planet, like, as I went about my business. And Tuesday, Mars Day, I was driving around because I had a car back then, and I saw so many cops on the road that day. Like, every few blocks, I would just be driving along and I'd pass by another police car. And it really struck me. Like, police are completely martial forces. They're like somewhat militaristic. They're like, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And they go along with all those things. And I never would have made that association because it seems so modern. Then when you see it in front of you, you say, wow, that makes a lot of sense. Also,
right.
While we're talking about... Oh, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, to that point then, if we're talking about substitutions in ritual, and I honestly probably would not do this myself, but like if you're working with that association of police, we'll say, then using something in the ritual for you that symbolizes and embodies that aspect of society, I think is a perfect substitution. I think that's like spot on, in fact, yeah.
You could etch a little layman into like a police badge and wear it during the ritual.
Yeah, exactly.
Speaking of astrological associations and weird ingredients, I always go back to this one chapter in one of the 3 books of occult philosophy of Heinrich Agrippa. So this is centuries later, right? This is the Renaissance. So this is way, way, way after any of this Greco-Egyptian material. But the tradition is preserved. He has lists of extremely weird ingredients for his perfumes of different planets. So I'll just as an example, I have it open in another tab here. For the moon, make a suffumigation of the head of a frog dried, the eyes of a bull, the seed of white poppy, frankincense, and camphor, which must be incorporated with menstruous blood, or the blood of a goose. So, I mean, is he really suggesting that you have to like take someone's diva cup and mix up these plants and mashed frogs' heads inside of it? I don't think he is. I think that this is a little bit of a cheeky passage, which is getting you to think about these associations. I mean, it's quite obvious what menstrual blood would have a connection to the moon for, and so you learn by reading these entries to think symbolically about the ingredients around you, and that the line between what's a symbol and what's an object, what's a literal thing, kind of breaks down.
Well, plus these things, incenses, herbs, do have these really, really fancy names for them. They'll call one thing by something really, really fancy, like, Apollo's ear will be an herb, but when you read it, you won't know it because you haven't been indoctrinated or, pulled in, you haven't been educated about the meaning of Apollo's ear. So you're confused. What do you mean Apollo's ear? What could that possibly mean? But if you're in the tradition, you understand, you know that it's this specific herb. I'm making Apollo's ear up, but there are actually lists of these.
Yeah. Well, I mean, if you get into like any of the alchemical materials of Renaissance and stuff, that's like it's all that sort of stuff. It's often completely incomprehensible to anyone that doesn't already know.
So how much of this is? See, this to me brings up a question here, because there's some things here which seem like you should probably have them. I won't go into the names for now, the barbaric names, the nomina barbara. But I for example, abstinence. Do I really need to abstain? And I bring that question up because I actually asked this question on the occult channel on Reddit, like how many people actually do abstain before they perform their rituals. And like one guy replied, nah, maybe I'll wash my hands. So, what is this necessary? Is this something that one would need to do? What about the contritus? Is that important? And that of course that leads into the question about what is contritus.
I think these things work on multiple levels, and none of them by themselves make or break the ritual, but the combined effect does. For what it's worth, I also do not practice abstinence before a ritual, and I just try to be as clean as possible. If I can take a shower before, then I do that, and if not, I'll wash my face and hands, just like Stevie Wonder says. But I think that with abstinence in particular, it can function on a couple levels. So one of them is just that kind of cleanliness, physically, but I think there are also a couple things that it can do mentally and emotionally. One of them being maybe a little bit outdated, that if you have shame around sex, that you have a clear conscience if you abstain first. But I think that even if you don't have shame, there's another thing that happens, which is that it builds up tension. If you abstain before the ritual, you are you're not releasing tension in the way that you otherwise might, and this tension actually then gets channeled into the ritual. The excitement, the natural sort of I don't want to just say tension again, but the the fact that you're a little bit keyed up can actually become energy or fuel for the ritual proceedings, and help you experience them more vividly. So I don't think it's necessary. Like, it's not going to work if you don't do it, but I do see that there's a purpose behind it.
Yeah, I pretty much agree with all of that. Well, it depends, right? Like, if I'm like, I usually try and plan my ritual practice like a few weeks ahead to give me time not only to, do any like purifications that I want to do, but also to just get in the right headspace. And I think that's like, it's like a very modern way to put it, but I think that's like a very important way to put it. So yeah, like Matt said there, like, and I really like your example about if you have shame surrounding sex. You know what I mean? Like, Agrippa is writing in a time when sex is seen as sinful. You know what I mean? The like cultural relevancy and like implications of what sex is different to what it was when Agrippa was writing. And I think that this comes back
but
to...
what about this? This is written, what, 1400 years before Agrippa. Do they have the
Right.
same kind of sexual taboos? Are you thinking that the writer of this or the tradition is... I mean, we do know that in the Hermetic text, it does take a dismal view of the body and that kind of thing. So that would be important to them, having practiced it. But also, yeah, go ahead, Frajran. But there's one more thing. Yeah, go ahead.
No, just finish what you were saying. Yeah.
No, I want to go off on a
parallel
topic, but different. Yeah.
So just a comment on this subject is that in Islam, after the sexual intercourse, it is an obligation for us to have a full shower. Like, we have to follow a procedure of like a completion of the act, and without doing that, we are not actually permitted to perform the prayer or the recitation of the Quran or any of the Islamic rituals. It's actually important for us for that to come to a completion, and that's done with having a shower or bathing or that is what is necessary. If I am to think about it, like, what I think the abstinence is about, it might be that if there is a charge there, and there is abstinence, like, a few days or whatever it is, I think it has an opportunity to be transmuted during some kind of performance or ritual. And I'm thinking along those lines. I'm thinking maybe that's the reason. But if the act is done, then it's like there has to be a completion to it so that the rituals can resume. I'm kind of thinking along those lines, if there is any kind of understanding or logic to it. And another thing...
Yeah, go ahead. No,
another quick comment on that is that when we do our rituals, it is also an obligation. We kind of have to perform an ablution. There is a ritual of washing certain parts with water or earth. And I feel like that's some kind of a charge, like it charges the whole being up, because this ablution tends to be on the extremities, so the very end points of the body. So when I kind of looked into this, like, we'd use natural substances, whether it's earth or clay or water. And then I think what that's about is the charging up of these particular areas as we step into a ritual, which then has more of a potency. So I just wanted to make those comments.
That's really cool. And I'm glad you brought that up. When you say earth, you literally mean earth?
Literally, yeah. Literally.
No, that's cool. I mean, I think that's... And I think it's cool because I've had experiences like with something like this with and then also there's been written things like Proclus says that you should bathe in the sea and have salt on your body.
Yes.
And then it says also you should be purified by fire. And some people think, well, how am I purified by fire? And then one writer said, well, maybe it means that you actually put, some type of chemical in your body, like sulfur,
Mm,
because it's associated with fire.
right,
Maybe,
right. Yeah,
you know,
interesting.
and
Because yeah,
that would somehow prepare your body, because it is, at least within the cosmology and within the metaphysics, the body does have a lower place on the ontological scale than many of these other things. So it does have to be transmuted in some way. So I think a
yeah,
ritual like that, like the purification, that the kind that you're talking about, or maybe with salt.
yeah. It does make sense to me. And like what you said about just thinking about what you said about the seawater. I mean, it's a salt, and that
Mhm.
kind of has a charge, and it just makes sense to me. When I kind of looked into why
Mhm.
does this do we have to follow this particular procedure? Like, how does that make sense? And that they're the kind of conclusions I came to.
Plus, there's the aspect, I think that it's also important to think of abstinence, if you will, and perhaps the purification part as well, as being aspects of a sacrificial mentality. That one is
I was
making a
actually
sacrifice.
literally just about to bring that out. So
Yeah,
yeah,
there's a
I appreciate
sacrifice,
you.
right? I mean, here we're not talking about sacrificing an animal, though in some of the rituals, for example, the one in the Greek magical papyri where it talks about a hawk, sacrificing a hawk. But here we're just talking about perhaps sacrificing sex for a few days or whatever it is.
Yeah, that would make sense. Yeah, that would. Yeah, absolutely.
Is that what you were thinking, Ryan?
Yeah, it's like very similar, and like I just want to like reiterate the point too that what is sex to you? If we're talking about abstinence specifically with regard to sex, because I mean, like abstinence can all like again, if I'm gonna do like a working that I'm like, this is a multi-day like high labor intense thing, maybe I'll think about not consuming any nicotine. Maybe I'll think about not smoking any weed or drinking alcohol. Like, and like if you're someone that smokes cigarettes, that could be a difficult thing. But what do these things mean to you? Are you using sex as a way to connect with your bodily self, to kind of like bask in the glory of the material? And I think that's a fine thing to do. I would dare say I do that to myself sometimes. You know what I mean? But okay, like if that's why you're thinking about sex, maybe we think about abstention. But if you think about sex as a way of enlightenment, as a way of releasing energy, okay, that's a different way of thinking about it. It's contextual. How do you contextualize sex? How do you contextualize alcohol? Is your drug use purely recreational, or are you doing it in a conscious and ritualistic way that allows you to, open certain parts of yourself? I think that these are important things to think about too, and they're going to be different for everyone.
Matt, do you want to add anything before we move on to this other topic?
I don't think there's much else to add. I pretty much agree with all of that.
Okay. So thank you. So the contritus, which to me seems obvious what it is, right? It's a drug, right? Which is a hallucinogenic of some kind. And been able to track it down to what it might be, verbena supina. But is that necessary? And to this, I mean, he does say, or at least the right, and again, remember that this is probably a ritual which was performed in the Egyptian temples, but which has now been rewritten by this and written down by this Theurgus magician, who makes pretty clear that it seems to me, a very, very religious person who is doing this for his daughter so that he can pass down this ritual and this knowledge to his daughter, so that she can then perform the ritual and then attain the type of enlightenment that he has attained. But as part of that, he makes very clear, he says, "O daughter, to take the juices of herbs and drugs." I'm sorry, furthermore, it is necessary for you, O daughter, to take the juices of herbs and drugs, which will be made known to you at the end of my sacred treatise. Sacred. So this is something which is not to be treated as though it's just something everyday thing. This is a very sacred item which he is and sacred knowledge which he is passing on to his daughter. But if it's a drug, and I see no reason not to believe that it's not, what does that mean for this ritual?
Well, I mean, I come at that question from kind of two directions. And the first just like directly relates back to what we were talking about. What is the synthemata, symbolon that is associated with that substance? If it doesn't have a particular one, how are you using it? Because like, yeah, I mean, like, I don't know anything about Verbena sapina. I just did a quick Google search, and like, it does make sense that that would be the substance. Like South Central Europe, Northwest India, North Africa is, you know, where it grows. But like, I will say that like when I've done this ritual, I've not used any substances. In fact, I've abstained from substances. So do I think that it's necessary? Like, I just don't. I can't. I can't, you know, fully accept that because, you know, like I said, I have had success with this one without.
Can you go into more details about that? Or?
Yeah, I mean, sure. I like. Well, I'll put it this way. I have no issues. And then like this is again, this like relates to issues of practicality as well and like my life in the real world. But okay, first of all, when we're talking about these sort of, you know, drugs, I guess, these substances that can have ritual usage, it's not an unintense experience that doesn't require like sometimes days of recovery, especially if you're mixing it with, you know, like magical practice or anything like that. So like if I'm trying after work every day of a week to practice a ritual, like frankly, I'm just not going to do shrooms or something beforehand because I have my own expectation. And again, this comes from me like having practiced this, right? So it might be different from you, but like I have my own expectation and relationship with a particular ritual. And adding in additional elements, though it could potentially, yeah, probably generate some pretty impressive results. A lot of the times, like as a magician who is also, you know, someone who works a full-time job and lives in the modern world, like you gotta just be careful with that sort of stuff because there have been times in my life when like I have associated too much ritual with the intoxicant. You know what I mean? They're like, especially when I first started to practice, like that was like a big part of things. And that got me into trouble, not only in a spiritual sense, but like also in a very real world, tangible, material sense too. You know, and like I'm always my own experiences in life and experiences with substances and stuff like definitely paints how I feel about it. I know that that's not probably exactly what you're looking for, but yeah, it's like it's complex, you know what I mean? And I really do think that like you need to know what's right for you. If you're someone that has never done any sort of like hallucinogen before, you don't understand the feeling, you don't like you don't have a strong connection with that sort of way of thinking, because like anyone that's done hallucinogens, like on TV, you know, it's like you see cartoon birds, but in reality, it's not much more than stuff like that. It's about how you think about things. It's like a psychedelic way of thinking, I find, especially in mushrooms specifically. And yeah, you just gotta like be. You just got to be careful with that. I don't really know what else to say. Like I would never want to like advise anyone to be like, yeah, go experience ego death and then do a theurgic rite. Like I just don't see that as the correct way. Like I do think you need to kind of ease yourself into these things. Does that mean I'm like against it or like think that there is not value in people that do? No, of course not. But for me, you know, you got to have respect for the substance. You got to understand what it is you're working with. And if you don't have those two things, I would say stay away from it.
Yeah, it's like people who do ayahuasca, you know, they go to whoops, got a lot of yeah, thank you. You know, people who do ayahuasca, they talk about them going to a holy man down in South America. And I think William S. Burroughs also talked about this in his Yahi letters. You know, when you go to them, they may be willing to give you ayahuasca, but they're going to give you, at least in his experience, they will give you the amount that they themselves imbibe, which is not for someone who's never taken it before, because they've been taking it for several years. Also, when they do the ayahuasca, they do it within a ritual context, and they are following that context and using it as a ritual element so that they can indeed contact these other planes of existence.
Yes, and I think that like living in a culture where, you know, it's a culture that is, despite, you know, the war on drugs and all this stuff, like when you look at how people live day to day, culture that's highly accepting of drugs and substances, but on a material basis, you know.
That's exactly what I was going to say.
Yeah, relating to these things purely through like the physical rather than the metaphysical. Yeah, you just got to be careful. Like I don't really know what else to say about that. Like I'm not saying like it can definitely work and be effective, but like what are drugs to you? How do you relate to these substances? That's a super important thing to think about.
Yeah, well, I could say that if I had done just some, sorry, Matt, one more thing. If I had done as part of a ritual, you know, the LSD that I did, the, you know, the peyote that I did, and whatever other drugs that I took, that would have probably provided a significant difference in importance of meaning to those experiences than what I actually did experience. Not saying, I mean, I had some very, very powerful experiences on those hallucinogens. They were pretty meaningful to me. I'm just wondering, you know, I think if they've been done more in the ritual context, if there had been rituals surrounding it and it being taken part of, that it may have really, really enhanced those experiences. Not in a, you're saying materialistic way, and that's probably the same sense that someone like a Kierkegaard would talk about, where we you know, the modern world tends to think of things in a very aesthetic sense. Everything is a matter of stimulating the senses and getting a sensory high, and, you know, getting variations of sensory highs, but it's all for the sensation rather than what the meaning of that is supposed to be. You know, I can go to a play and I'm going to get stimulated, and I'm going to be able to, you know, really take part and have a really, really theatrical experience. But is there a meaning where that play can actually place me into another plane of existence or put me into a different state of consciousness, which is beyond the aesthetic and becomes something more meaningful, such as what he would call the ethical or the religious. Sorry, Matt, I did cut you off.
No problem. I mean, no, it's all. I mean, it's all relevant. It's all part of the same point. I mean, I think that there is a lot of complexity around this topic because different people will have different opinions on. I mean, because drugs by themselves are loaded topics, and magic by itself is a loaded topic. These are both very taboo. So if you're trying to say, well, what about drug magic? People will just freak out, and the people have various motivations which will color their views on this topic. Some people will say, oh, the true magus will never do something as debased as use drugs in their rituals. And other people will say, oh, this is the secret history of magic and mysticism throughout the ages, that they were all always on drugs, and that explains all the effects because they were chemical effects caused by their use of plant medicines or whatever it might be. And I don't think either of those extremes is really correct. I think there is a use for drugs in magic, in a way, if you want them. I think that it's a possible methodology that you could potentially incorporate into certain kinds of things. I certainly don't think it's an explanation for how magic works or prerequisite to doing magic. The one particular use that I think hallucinogenic drugs can have as a method in magic is as an initiatory experience. When you do them in a certain ritual context, they can open you up to a new kind of seeing that you then will be able to have a reference point for, which you can then use in non-drug contexts through magical techniques. And because this particular ritual that we're talking about, the so-called Mithras Liturgy, or I guess the Immortalization Rite, is an initiatory ritual in a way. You're introducing yourself, up and up and up into these higher and higher spheres. You're being granted some form of immortality, supposedly, at the top, and then coming back to the world. I think that this is one of those things that could potentially be an appropriate place for mixing drugs and magic because it is initiatory. The drugs are opening you up to this level of experience that you might not have had before. But I also think there's something to be said for once you've had that experience, you are initiated into that sphere, you have the familiarity required. You shouldn't need to keep doing the drugs over and over again to recapture that. And if you do have to keep doing that, then maybe I would question whether that initiatory experience was really as initiatory as it was supposed to be.
Yeah, I'm fully on board with that. And I just will say, and because I suppose we're no longer just talking amongst ourselves, and there are people out there listening. I've had some really bad experiences mixing drugs and magic, which is why I'm very kind of hesitant to not only, again, and I've said, I will now incorporate that into my ritual, but it is not a common, it's not the thing that I do. It's a very special occasion type thing, or for very particular rituals. And yeah, man, it can open you up to some bad stuff. So just, God, if you're listening, if you're on YouTube and you're using this as some sort of how-to guide on magic, please just be careful because it can mess with you. I'll leave it at that. But yeah, it's that's the fact of the matter,
When you come back to, and thank you, yes, anyone who's listening and has not done drugs or has perhaps wondered what they would want to do drugs, you always want to be careful. And we're definitely not advocating one way or the other. We're just providing our own experiences, which, as Ryan says, have been good and bad. I can certainly attest to that. Some of the worst experiences I've had in my life have been on drugs. It took me almost a year to recover from them, so take that as a warning.
I remember I was in my first year of my undergrad, and I was just getting into this stuff. I was very new, and I was yeah, I'm gonna do some shrooms and I'm gonna practice some Solomonic magic. And like, needless to say, it did not go particularly well. And I'll put it this way: I was meeting with our school chaplain for the next several weeks, like twice a week.
Out of all the possible things to do, you chose demons.
Right? Yeah, I know. Like, yeah, maybe that wasn't my own fault, right? That's what I'm saying, though. You got to know what you're getting into.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I just
I
wanted
think,
to say,
Farjana,
I just
go
wanted
ahead.
to make just one comment. I mean, it's also, the times that these books were written, these people had a lot of time on their hands. So,
Yeah.
they could probably sleep it off for a few days if they needed to, right? So,
Right. Yeah.
That
there
is
is
an
that aspect
interesting
of it.
and I think Ryan's been alluding to that aspect of this as well. And I've been actually mulling it over. How much time do you have to participate in these rituals and to live a ritualistic life? To commit yourself really as in depth as possible as you can. As busy as people are these days, I'm sure people were busy back then, but the tempo of the day was much slower, I think, for people in the past, and I have had a taste of that as on my grandparents' farm, where the days just seemed a bit slower, and you were able to take in more because there just wasn't all of the hubbub and everything going on around you. And I think that type of existence was truer back then, where events were able to sink into one's personality, one's sense of reality, than they are now, where everything's just flying by so fast. You got to just keep up with the sensory excitation. But
well, I like, again, if you are someone who is consuming like magic and especially like grimoire adjacent material as content, like capital C content, don't bother. Like, I know that sounds maybe a little bit harsh, but like, no, it's not content. It's not what it is. You gotta think a little bit deeper about these things.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of times too, the kind of time that you need to get into this stuff is not necessarily a lot of time per day. It's not like it takes a heroic effort within the span of a single day to do it.
Yeah.
The kind of time that you need is a little bit every day for many days. Like you need a long time in the span of, over days and days, over weeks and weeks, over months and months, over years to build it up. And if you have that kind of time and that kind of patience, which is equally unavailable in the modern day, where we are looking for quick gratification and like not really spending the time to become consistent or patient in order to slowly master something, then that's going to be the thing that is in short supply. But if you can commit a few minutes a day per day and really just consistently grind that out and whatever, meditate for a few minutes a day, do a quick ritual once a day, like every day, you will slowly immerse yourself into it in a way that I think is still doable for someone with a job.
And there are many aspects to theurgy as well, like August Ujdevinus, who's probably just slaughtered his name, but he's very famous in doing theurgic texts. He wrote one on philosophy and theurgy, and wrote two really, really important books about this subject. He talks about the different ways one can do theurgy. And for example, there's what he calls the hermeneutical, which is the reading of ritual texts or theurgic texts, where you're looking and gaining knowledge. That is, in and of itself can also be a theurgic, ritualistic type of experience to gain, theurgic power.
Yeah, there are in some religions, I mean, even I think in Catholicism and I imagine Orthodoxy, there are certain rituals of reading texts and basically meditating on them as you walk around.
Yeah.
And seeing the meaning of the text come alive in your experience as you
Like
a fairly prominent Sufi practice, Farzana?
Sorry, what was the question, sorry?
Just like the ritual recitation of text in a Sufi context.
Yeah, it tends to be a lot about that. And I think, it's to do with the vibrational frequency. Like as we go higher up in the planes, the vibrations get a lot more intense and a lot more faster, I think, instead of having a very low vibrational field.
Now, I'm sorry to make this jump myself, Chaz, but I and if you want to touch it, like wait till next session to touch on this, I totally understand.
Yeah,
but
I wanted to maybe think of this as a stopping point. We can take up perhaps your subject as well as the other one next time.
Yeah, great. I wanted to talk about the nomina barbari and how language relates to all of this. And actually, Farzana, I would love to hear your thoughts on how Arabic specifically. I'm assuming you do your practice in Arabic, but I mean I don't know that. But I would love to know your thoughts on how the Arabic language specifically, kind of embodies these ideas in your own practice.
That would be really interesting because I mean I guess that's the reason that I'm here, because I'm looking for the commonality, I'm looking for where the links are, and I'm looking for the universal aspect of it. So as well as I'm doing it this way because it is part of who I am, it's important for me to see where and how the fundamental secrets of the universe are the same. So that's why I'm very interested in the way that you will do it.
Kind of lame that the deeper you go into those explorations, the more the answer seems to be say your prayers and read your texts.
Yeah.
Also
God.
enact.
Yeah.
I think
unfortunately exactly what my pastor told me when I was 10 years old.
or go to liturgy.
Yeah.
Or go to liturgy, which we take this under our own responsibilities as theurgists and magicians. We perform our own liturgy or ritual practice so that we can gain some type of insight into these things. Although being part of a community, I think, is an important aspect of theurgic activity as well. And it's something I want to consider and discuss in future sessions.
What's also important for me is that what has worked for you, because if that's worked for you and this particular thing has worked for me, why? Because if you know the why, then you'll know the how, and then if you know the how, then everybody can do it and get there. And that's what I'm interested in your story, the way that you've done it, what you have experienced, because that's where I think we'll recognize the thread. And that's why I think it's very important for me to know how you did it and for us to share those experiences.
Yeah, for sure. I love the and I've brought this up several times throughout our conversations, but that why how dichotomy is so important. And it's something that I reflect on so often, especially in our modern materialist world. So yeah, really excited to hear what you got to say about it.
Same. Yeah. In Buddhism, they say a complete practice should include body, speech, and mind. So I think that also goes along with what we've been talking about today. How do you embody the thing? How do you speak the thing? And how do you sort of attend to the thing?
Yeah, love it.
Cool. Well, thank you all, and we'll talk next week.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a great week, you guys. And so we'll switch back.
That's a wrap for the December 15th installment of the Iamblichus reading group. As we agreed after the recording, this was an exciting discussion, and we look forward to the next episode when we get into the content of the mystical ascent through the heavens, which the Rite describes. Join us as we discuss Nomina Barbara, enchanted recitations, ecstatic visions, and more. See you then. And don't forget to leave a comment at our YouTube channel. We really appreciate the time you spend on that. Thank you.